Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Felix Warneken. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. He's interested in developmental psychology, culture, cognition, and comparative animal behavior. His research group addresses questions like how and why human social life involves complex interactions between individuals working together, and what cognitive skills allow them to do so. They do so by examining the earliest forms of cooperation in young children, untangling the processes shaping cooperation across development in different sociocultural contexts, and also comparing human cooperation with that of our closest evolutionary relatives, that is the great apes like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and other animals like that. So, Dr. Warneken, thank you a lot for taking the time to be on the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, it's my pleasure. So let me first ask you, because I guess that this is very interesting that today we're going to talk about basically child development and also comparing it with certain aspects of the behavior of other primate species, particularly the ones that are the closest to us, like chimpanzees. So we're going to focus our conversation on certain types of behavior, like particularly cooperative behavior. So could you please first tell us, perhaps, when people talk about these kinds of behavior, they use different words like, for example, cooperative behavior, pro-social behavior. Sometimes they talk about altruistic behavior. But since we are referring to biology and psychology here, could you tell us, perhaps, what are the correct definitions of each of these types of behavior, or perhaps if they have some things in common, or perhaps some of them are synonym of others? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it also sometimes depends a little bit who the audience is that people you want to tailor it to the history of terminology in certain disciplines. So I view cooperation as the overarching term for different kinds of behaviors that convey some benefit to other individuals. So that would be both altruistic benefit in terms of someone paying a cost or doing something to benefit another individual, and mutualistic acts where two or more people are doing something together to convey benefits to everybody involved. And I think the other important distinction is here that sometimes it's defined exclusively in terms of fitness, costs, and benefits, right? And so this leads also to tricky things where people say, well, altruism defined in terms of fitness, costs, we know, and benefits, we know can't exist. So this becomes a little tricky there. But so what I talk about when it comes to my research, it's really focused on what's called the proximate mechanisms of these behaviors. So there are big questions about the ultimate function of cooperative behaviors, and then when it comes to behaviors that come to a cost to the self to benefit other individuals, it becomes really tricky to understand how something like that could evolve by natural selection. And so while that is always in the background as trying to understand how this is embedded evolutionarily, my research is really more focused on testing empirically the proximate mechanisms, the psychological capacities like cognitive abilities, motivations, and so forth that implement these kinds of behaviors in an organism. So that's what I talk about. So when in our work we say, oh, these kids act altruistically, what we mean by that is they are altruistically motivated to do something. It's kind of a shorthand for saying this is an altruistically motivated behavior. We're not claiming necessarily, I mean, maybe in some countries we do, that this is a behavior that conveys fitness benefits of an altruistic sort. So that just as a point of clarification.
Mm-hmm. So in your work, you're much more interested in the proximate aspects of behavior in comparison with, for example, the ultimate aspects that are the ones that have to do with explaining where does that behavior comes from, evolutionarily speaking, and perhaps what is its function. So you're interested in the sorts of situations and contexts that perhaps evoke those sorts of behavior.
Right. So, I mean, it's embedded, obviously, in these big questions that started with Darwin about how something can evolve. But then there's a long tradition of research, especially 20th century theoretical biology, to come up with models about how cooperation of different types can evolve by natural selection. And we use that to say, okay, people have shown that, for example, reciprocity, direct reciprocity, where we take turns, for example, can explain certain types of cooperative behaviors. And we take that and then ask the question, okay, if that's true, like how is that implemented in the organism? Like what psychological abilities do you need to have to engage in these behaviors in the first place? And then that really is a major question, because like even if you've solved the problem of how something could in principle evolve, you have to show how certain organisms actually do it. And so for us then that's the question, for example, why, if it seems so simple, why reciprocity how reciprocity could explain it, why is it still so rare in different animals, right? That chimpanzees engage in certain types of reciprocity, mostly in friendships, where they are able to track how different individuals have treated them in the past, right? But then this can't really, but they still don't seem to engage in what people have called calculated reciprocity, or generally speaking, more forward-looking, prospective forms of reciprocity, where you have to assess how likely is it that someone else will reciprocate in the future and so forth, and tailor your current behavior accordingly in light of some prediction basically about what happened in the future. So something that we as adult humans at least are able to do easily, or maybe not easily, but we can do it. And maybe this explains why certain types of cooperation are just not as widespread in other animals compared to humans, because these cognitive abilities may not be there. So that, I think, is one part to the puzzle of the spread of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, really to understand why certain species are really able to cooperate among, I mean, the individuals that are part of the species are able to cooperate among themselves, and in others perhaps it's more difficult, and also to understand where altruistic behavior comes from. It is also important for us to really know the aspects of a particular species, of its cognition that work at a social level, right? Because if we don't have those cognitive tools in place, then the individuals are really not able to establish those kinds of relationships and of interactions, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, another example for this is mutualism, right? Where I think that just is easy to explain why, in principle, we should engage in mutualistic behaviors all the time, right? Because it's something we both benefit from. And so that is like from an evolutionary perspective is like easy. But when you look at the psychological mechanism, you realize that actually it's maybe not that easy, because we need to have certain capacities in place to, for example, first of all, realize that if we work together on this task, we can benefit more than if I just tried it alone and you tried it alone. Or I mean, if we have that insight, we then still have to figure out how do we go about it, right? We have to coordinate our efforts. Maybe this requires some kind of mind reading, more generally speaking, or at least some behavioral coordination, and this can be tricky. And then and the other issue is then once we are able to solve this problem, say we lift each other up to reach a higher tree and obtain apples from it, or we hunt together, or something like that. Once we are successful in our mutualistic collaboration, we still have to figure out a way of distributing the profit, basically, of what we've obtained. So there are other psychological mechanisms that you need to have to solve this problem of how to divvy up rewards. So when you get to the bottom of these kinds of behaviors and really try to spell out how you can, how individuals can be skillful cooperators, you realize that there are many questions that we have to ask, and a purely evolutionarily oriented analysis about costs and benefits can't really provide an answer to why certain species would engage in certain types of cooperation, others not.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that one good example of that would be that if we have a particular population where all the individuals are cooperative, we only need one that is uncooperative or that tries to exploit others or to take advantage of others' labor to really over time break down that society, because if one adopts that strategy, then a second one would adopt it, and the third one, and the fourth one. And I mean, we really have to have in place certain tools, like, for example, cheater detection devices to really try to punish people or individuals from other species that are uncooperative or don't follow the rules. Otherwise, that particular society or that particular tribe or troop or population would really break down over time and would probably go extinct. Right.
That's right. And I think it's really a fascinating question how this works in humans, and that we have so many different ways at our disposal to deal with these kinds of problems. That basically what you're describing is the free rider problem, like how do we deal with this? And so what I'm fascinated by and what we study is to see how kids become these skillful cooperators that can solve this problem, right? Because to be a competent cooperator, evolutionary theory tells us you have to be able to solve this free rider problem in some way, right? And so what I've proposed is that kids have basically two different sets of skills to generate benefit on the one hand. So this is the ability to, for example, what I described earlier, to realize that if we work together, we can generate some mutualistic benefit, or to engage in some form of reciprocity, I would have to somehow, for example, realize your need, right? That this is a situation where you really are in need, and then I offer my help or give you money or something like that, and that can then start a reciprocal interaction, right? So you need to be able to understand, first of all, how to generate benefit in the first place, and then once that is the case, however, you also need to have, and the skills for this then would be, for example, empathy in situations where it's about the other person's pain, or sympathy. People switch the terminology or sometimes, but it's like resonating with the emotional needs of other people, or having some understanding about other people's goals. So this is something that I've studied extensively in kids. To what extent do kids detect that another individual has some practical problem, can't achieve their goal, and then help out in some pragmatic way to achieve that? Or collaborative situations where one individual can solve the problem, and now we have to somehow form a collective group the minimum group here being 2 individuals, to solve the task together. So this is kind of the one area of being able to generate benefit in the first place. And then the other thing is, however, you still need to figure out the other problem, which is the free rider problem, or I would say how to distribute benefit. And so these are other kinds of mechanisms that kids may be developing only later in development. So what I argue, I mean, with evidence, obviously, like summarized it in a recent paper, that kids early on have the basic capacities to generate benefit through helping, sharing, collaborating, and so forth. But it's only later, over time, that that kids then develop the skills to solve the free rider problem. That like a 1.5-year-old is already willing to help, but they're not yet able to compute who is a good reciprocator and who isn't, and that's only later kicking in. Or they're not yet thinking about fairness norms, who is someone who is acting fairly or unfairly, or regulating their own behavior in a fair or unfair manner, to think about how, for example, other people view them as a good or bad cooperator and so forth. So the argument is that this is actually kicking in somewhat later in ontogeny. So yeah, this has been what we've been doing a lot, and that was inspired by a really great paper by Brett Calcutt, who pointed out that in evolutionary treatment of cooperation, the focus has been so much on this free rider problem, and people kind of forgot about the problem of how to generate benefit. And what I noticed is that in psychology, at least in developmental psychology, the focus has been so much on how to generate benefit, but people didn't really address the free rider problem as much as you see in evolutionary treatments of this. So what we've been trying in our lab is to try to bring these two things together and understand these two different skill sets and how they emerge over ontogeny.
Mm-hmm. So children really start to exhibit cooperative behavior, or at least some sort of cooperative proclivities very early in their lives, right? So is it the case that we could talk about that as being sort of an innate proclivity that humans and other species as well might have for cooperation?
Yeah, so I don't, just to clarify, I don't use innate,
okay.
Even though people attribute it to me all the time, because I think there's a lot of confusion about it, where people say, if someone says something is innate, it's like present at birth, right, and it's not changeable and all these things that people in biology would never think, right? But somehow in psychology, that's often how it's interpreted. So I usually use biological predisposition to stay away from this and try to explain that. But so yes, I think the evidence shows by us and other people that kids show altruistic behaviors or cooperative behaviors where they care about other people's needs and welfare and so forth, that is likely based on a biological predisposition, as opposed to kids having only a biological predisposition to be purely selfish, and then they have to be kind of trained up to also care about others, have to internalize norms, and that reprograms them from purely selfish individuals to individuals who also care about others altruistically, at least in some context. And so the evidence that we have for this, like so from our work, that early on 14-month-olds, 18-month-old infants will be helpful to others who, like someone is failing to open a door and then the kid holds the door open, or someone is cleaning up and then drops something on the ground and can't get it back, they hand it to the person and so forth. And they do it spontaneously without someone requesting the help. They do it without being rewarded. So we have several studies where we manipulate whether the kid gets a reward for helping or not. Doesn't seem to affect it, sometimes even negatively, that kids, once they learn that they can get paid for helping, they later are less likely to help. They do it without the parent in the room. So it's not that the parent is pulling strings in the background, and that's why they help. My colleague Robert Heppach has a beautiful study showing that kids even help when they can't even see the recipient. The recipient is behind a curtain, and so someone drops something into a box and they can push it back so the recipient gets the item back that they need for a task. And so it's not that they need these cues from others or some kind of reputational gain for helping. So this seems to be the case, at least in early kids, that they do it spontaneously and really in order to benefit others. So that's kind of the major evidence we have for that. And one major issue, however, basically with any developmental study with kids is that you show it early on and then you rule out certain mechanisms that could account for it. So like if a 14-month-old shows the behavior, I mean, it can't be due to them like reading Immanuel Kant or reading the Bible or something like that, or learning explicit moral norms. So that's out of the question. There's also clearly not a long reward history that kids, I mean, there have been models in the 80s arguing that kids early on engage in these prosocial behaviors just because they're told to do it, and over time they get rewarded, and then it becomes internalized, and then it's in teenagerhood that they have internalized the norm, and then they get a kick out of helping others. So these kinds of models are clearly out of the window. But then you can always argue that, well, maybe it's like a fast track from being a purely selfish individual to becoming altruistic, and it's still driven by parents teaching the kids how to do it or modeling it for them and so forth. I mean, that seems very implausible. I mean, they're not even toilet trained at that age, but it's always possible, and people come up with all kinds of stories how this could in principle happen. And then so the solution I think that we have is to also look at our closest evolutionary relatives like the chimpanzees or bonobos, who do not have these cultural norms and are not trained to be altruistic or follow social norms in any kind of context. And so if chimpanzees show these behaviors as well, it's more parsimonious to assume that the last common ancestor possessed these traits as well, right? And so because we find that chimpanzees also engage in these kinds of helping behaviors, maybe in a more limited way than we find in young kids, but still they open doors for others, they hand over object if someone else is in need, they do it without getting a reward, without any kind of reciprocation, without anyone harassing them to do it and so forth. They also do it spontaneously. So because of all these reasons, we think that at least this basic capacity to act altruistically, so in order to benefit another individual with a goal, is something that maybe the last common ancestor already possessed.
Mm-hmm. So there are several things there. Let me first ask you this.
Yeah.
Do children exhibit these sorts of behaviors, and do they react in these sorts of ways to other people's behavior before an age where they can already be socialized and where they can really be taught to do those kinds of things? Because I mean that if not, there would be where people could propose certain alternative explanations, like for example when they refer to sociocultural aspects or sociocultural influences, or even perhaps things coming from behaviorism like operant conditioning and schedules of reinforcement and punishment and things like that could also possibly lead to those sorts of behaviors.
Right. So, I mean, just one example. I mean, if the assumption is, for example, that they do it because of a concrete reward, what we can do in an experiment is manipulate that. Like one group of kids always gets rewarded for helping, another group of kids never gets rewarded for helping. And so if the motivation is really because they want to get a reward, then you would expect that the kids in the condition where they receive a reward should be much more likely to help than kids in the other group. But there's no difference. We don't find a difference between these two groups. And in addition, we run many, many studies with repeated trials where kids like 20 times have the opportunity to help. And they do it even if repeatedly they don't get a reward. Okay? So that makes it seem really implausible that they are doing it because they want to get a concrete reward. Not only that, if they get a reward, they're later less likely to help in a future situation without a reward. And so one interpretation for this is that they are originally intrinsically motivated to do it. So they do it for the sake of helping because the other one needs it and not because they want anything in return. But when then there is the salient reward they get, their motivation changes from an intrinsic motivation to an extrinsic motivation. And so that makes it less likely to help. So the point then is, if this is the mechanism, then we would expect that if at home they get rewarded all the time for helping, why would they then show it with a stranger they've never encountered in a novel situation in an experiment, right? So that seems really implausible that would be the case, right? So then people could argue, oh, it's intermittent reinforcement, so it's just like it's overgeneralizing to these kinds of contexts. But that is also a problematic assumption, because what we also show is that kids do it with a new person in a new context and novel kinds of tasks. So for example, we have a task where they're introduced to a box that has a hole on top and a flap on the side. So kids could not have ever seen this box before, maybe not even an object similar to it. And we show them that in order to retrieve things from the inside, you have to open the flap. And then later in the experiment, another experimenter comes in and drops a spoon through the hole of this box and can't get it out. And then kids at 18 months open the flap and retrieve it and give it back to the person. And they don't do it in a control condition in which the person throws the spoon in the box on purpose. So this shows that it generalizes to a novel kind of situation. So this again becomes really tricky, how you would be able to explain this behavior by just some kind of reinforcement model. And so that's kind of the modern evidence against that. And then but there's also older evidence against it from the times when everything was explained by some behavioristic principle. And there people just failed over and over to induce prosocial behavior in kids because the teacher rewarded them for one behavior, and then in front of the teacher they would continue to do that. But then when it was another teacher or at home, everything collapsed. So it remained context specific. And so if it's so spread out across even novel contexts with novel people and so forth, these kinds of explanations just become really, really implausible, right? And then again, but you can always come up with the story surrounding that. But then with the chimpanzees, that would be the other evidence where there just is not this history. We know that from the chimpanzees that we study, that they don't have parents who over and over reward them if they hand over an object or open a door for them or in a novel kind of context. So this just seems really, really implausible.
Mm-hmm. And these kinds of studies that you are talking about, have they already been validated cross-culturally? Because I would guess that would be another major source of evidence for them being biologically based, right?
That's a really good point, and that is also the case. I mean, so my colleague Tara Callahan, she has been studying helping behaviors in kids in Canada, in India, and Peru. We've studied kids in Germany, in the US. Other people have studied kids in other parts of Canada or other parts of the US. My colleague Yasha Katna, he studied kids in India. And in all these cases, you find that it's around toddlerhood that kids show these behaviors. So this really indicates that that maybe there's more to it than just training kids up to be helpful. I want to add to this that sometimes the assumption is if the claim is there is a biological predisposition, then it is not influenced by socialization. That is not the claim at all, right? It's similar to saying there is a biological predisposition for a person's height, right? That they grow tall, and this does not preclude the possibility that nourishment also contributes to it, right? But it's like there's certain constraints placed on these kinds of things, and the argument is not that if you don't nourish someone, they will still grow to be tall, right? I mean, this is just like not what is the case. So what we're really trying to argue against is this notion that the biological predisposition is to be purely selfish, and there's nothing in the program here to also care about others. And we say, no, obviously we have inclinations to care about ourselves in certain contexts, or most contexts, but then there are certain other contexts in which some altruistic inclination to care also about the welfare of others kicks in. Like if someone is crying, for example, babies feel really sad about it too, and distressed, and then try to comfort individuals. Or if in our studies they see that someone is struggling with a problem, they also have the spontaneous tendency to try to help out with that. So this predisposition seems to be there early on as well. And now the thing is that obviously this can be shaped, right? So the more opportunities they have for helping, maybe the faster they do it, or the more reliably they do it. If in addition someone is reinforcing it, this may also be helpful for them to be more helpful. But the important thing is that it must not be done in a way that undermines this initial inclination, right? So this is also often called inductive parenting. So this would be something that people have shown is an important thing for empathy-based responding. So for example, it's really not necessary to explain to a child it's bad if someone is crying. It's more important, they already get that early on. But what's important to show them maybe in certain circumstances is that the reason the person is crying is because I did something that caused that, right? You're crying because I took away your favorite toy. I took away your fire truck. And in the moment, I was just so focused on playing with the fire truck, and I didn't realize that you also wanted to play with the fire truck, and this is why you are crying. So inductive parenting would be something to just point out the connection between my behavior and your emotional response. And so then the idea is that is kind of the pedagogy that leads to more prosocial behavior. I think a similar thing we can maybe apply to these helping behaviors, that if parents or other people are pointing out that someone is in need of help, this should facilitate kids' helping tendency, but not because it implants the idea of it's important to help people in kids' minds in the first place, but it's more guiding their behavior and in a more practical way of them then realizing how they can help and what circumstances actually are those kinds of circumstances that, although maybe a little bit complex, also indicate that someone else is in need. So yeah, these are the kinds of things where I just wanted to clarify, because some people sometimes, or very often actually, people misinterpret it to mean that when there is some kind of biological predisposition, there's then no role for socialization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, even when comparing with other animals, like for example the primates, it's also the case in biology that when we're talking about another species behavior, I mean, perhaps we can say that they have a set of behaviors that at their disposal that they can deploy when interacting with other individuals. But I mean,
Right.
they are always influenced by the environmental circumstances, like the ecological conditions, the social conditions, and perhaps even in humans we can also add to the environment our culture, right?
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I mean, it's always fascinating to see what kind of cooperative behaviors different species engage in. But then often it is very restricted to a certain type of behavior, like the mother feeding their young or something, or ants building a certain type of thing together, right? And so, and that's always super impressive and really interesting, and shows that cooperation, we can't just say this is human unique, and it would be really ridiculous. But what is really fascinating about humans is that we are able to extend it in so many forms across so many contexts and also social relationships, right? And so this also then poses important questions about the similarities and differences. So when we just go back to this thing about chimpanzees and human children, while it is the case that there is overlap in this basic capacity to help others, as we would claim, there are also major constraints on helping behaviors or cooperative behaviors more generally in chimpanzees. So for example, it does not easily translate to situations where a chimpanzee could just have food for themselves, right? So that this is something where if they can have food for themselves, this kind of overrides most of the time all kind of concern about others. And then in humans, we are developed this ability to not just think about, oh, I want this thing right now for myself, but also be concerned about others. So this really places a major constraint on what chimpanzees are doing. Or another thing is that as humans, we also become able to think about the needs of people we don't even interact with, right? That through communication, verbally, or now through media, we are able to think about these people we will never ever encounter, we just hear about, and can also maybe picture their plight, and then it elicits some form of loyalty, cooperation, sympathy with them, and we engage in a cooperative behavior that is just inconceivable in other animals, right? So that's what is so fascinating, I think, about humans, that we are able to take it so much farther.
Mm-hmm. And is it possible for us to already find moral preferences or moral behavior in infants that that can't yet speak, for example, or really are very limited in terms of movement? Like, for example, if we show them a situation where two people are interacting with one another or something like that, through their behavior, like, for example, the way they suck on their pacifier or the attention they pay to the situation, like, for example, by monitoring their eye gazing and things like that. Is it possible to do that?
Yeah, there's work on kids, or infants, I should say, having preference more for familiar over unfamiliar others, those that are, and then that they're also in the first place differentiating between people that look more like them or talk more like them over those that are different, and then that maybe enters into their behavior as well, like in their decisions about how to cooperate and so forth. And I mean, this is an area of active study where the jury is still out. It's not totally clear, because the question is to what extent there's just a general preference for familiar over unfamiliar others that then just occurs in all kinds of behaviors, but it may not be tied to that particular behavior. So if someone says, like, oh, they're more likely to cooperate with in a task with one individual over another individual, this doesn't necessarily mean that kids are making the decision, I don't want to cooperate with this one over that one. It's just like I don't want to associate with this one over that one. So it's kind of a side effect of some other preference. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the evidence that exists so far, how these things develop. And like the findings are often, if you put kids as infants in a situation where they have to choose, like they're forced to either go this way or that way, interact with a familiar other over an unfamiliar other, or someone who looks more like them or talks more like them over another one, then to break the tie, basically, they go with one over the other. But that does not yet mean that when they're interacting with someone who does not look like them or does not talk like them, they would not be willing to cooperate with them, right? So there's a difference between kind of a forced preference for one over the other and the question to what extent they extend cooperation to individuals, if that makes sense. So there's really something like, say, you like one of your siblings more than the other siblings. So if you kind of forced with whom for whom you would cook dinner, say, you say, okay, if I can choose only one of them, I'm going with my, say, younger brother over my older brother. But this does not yet mean that you would not cook dinner for your older brother, right? So this is like, that's the thing. So, and sometimes people confuse that and think that just because there is some preference for one over the other, this means it's a behavior to be reluctant to be cooperative towards those that are not exactly like you.
Mm-hmm. So do infants already show any sort of in-group favoritism? And I mean, when I refer to groups here, perhaps it is better to explain what we really mean by groups in this context. Because I mean, you refer to the fact that perhaps children or infants prefer people that look like them, but I'm not sure if that would count as a group in the sense of the child having a sort of group identity and identifying certain people as being part of their group and preferring cooperative behavior with those people or not.
Right. So, I mean, one really fascinating series of experiments is by Katie Kinsler, who has this paradigm where people are the same race or a different race from the infant, but importantly also they may talk in the same language as the infant's parents. Like the infants don't talk yet, but like what they're exposed to, say French and English, and their kids, these infants and later kids are more likely to choose to receive something from one over the other. When both are offering toys, they go with one over the other. But the interesting thing is that when you pit appearance, like skin color, against linguistic cues, like language, then language wins. So kids are more tuned into the language part than appearance. And so this is really a fascinating finding, because this then raises the question, why would that be the case? So one thing that they rule out is just because they think they can communicate with this one over the other. So it seems to have deeper reasons, like, for example, group membership is just more easily identifiable by how we speak, and not so much by appearance, evolutionarily speaking, right? Because that we would encounter people that really look very different from us. This is something fairly recent in evolutionary history. And then just more generally speaking, groups and talking in different ways is just an encounter you have all the time, right? Even like accents are sufficient for these infants too, by the way, to identify with one over the other, or prefer one over the other. So it seems like when it comes to in-group markers, a language seems to be particularly important.
Mm-hmm. And in the case of other primates, particularly the great apes, are there other species that exhibit mechanisms like, for example, kin selection, that is, do they prefer to devote their time and their resources to other individuals that are genetically related, and also reciprocal altruism, where they prefer to establish cooperative relationships with individuals with whom they already have a sort of an history of successful cooperation that is reciprocal. And are there any other great ape where you find some sort of in-group favoritism, in the sense of them preferring to establish cooperative relationships with individuals from their own troop, being them genetically related or not, or being them their friends in the reciprocal altruistic sense? Or
right? Yes, I mean, some kin bias that is widespread across many different species, and it's not even clear where to stop to get started and where that's the case. And that I mean, obviously in humans that is also the case, right? There are many things are at play in different kinds of situations. So kin for sure, and then different kinds of reciprocity. I mean, what I alluded to earlier is that in chimpanzees, you also see reciprocity between individuals over time, but it seems to be focused mostly on these long-term relationships and not so much keeping exactly track of, like, okay, yesterday you did this to me and now today I do the equivalent to you or something like that, but it's more over longer periods of time. And then with group, absolutely. I mean, this is something where chimpanzees, they are not particularly friendly towards at least male outgroup members, right? So it's not a good idea to encounter as a sole male a group of other males from another group. So that is usually not a funny experience for those lone individuals. So there is clearly something where it's very much in group. There's also work showing that maybe in bonobos this is a little bit more relaxed, that they're more open to mingling with their neighbors than our chimpanzees, where this is more of a competitive, acrimonious relationship. And so that would also be something where I think in humans it's just really striking how, despite all the trouble, I mean, it's not that it's an easy thing at all, that we are able to engage with other groups and are willing to do that in the first place and find certain norms surrounding that. I mean, there could be moral norms, but they can also be economic relationships and how to figure that out between groups. So that certainly is something that characterizes humans to be able to negotiate between groups. I'm not saying unique in humans, but certainly special.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've also asked you about that particular aspect of groupish behavior, let's say, because, I mean, isn't it the case that when we talk about relationships of cooperation or competition or conflict, I mean, it is a bit more complex than simply saying that people tend to prefer relationships of cooperation, or other animals as well, with members of their own group, because between or among members of the same group, they also compete a lot among them, right? And they establish hierarchies both in humans and in other primate species and things like that. So perhaps when we are referring to humans and other primates preferring interacting with members of their same groups, perhaps that is more salient when they are also encountering other groups, and perhaps they need to form cooperative relationships among them, or more strong cooperative relationships, to really be able to overcome the conflict between their group and the other group, something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So one example again with chimpanzees is that one of the cooperative behaviors that is talked about in the wild is patrolling, so that a group of males is patrolling the border of their territory, and this is where exactly they might encounter other group members or outgroup members. And so this is one form of cooperative behavior that is kind of risky, and they have to coordinate on some level to stay together and be quiet and so forth. And so that would be something where, because of maybe the outgroup threat, or taking the risk to confront outgroup members, this leads to a bit more cohesion and cooperativeness within the group. So yes, that is clearly the case.
Mm-hmm. And what about the importance of deception and self-deception here? Because we know that humans have this mechanism of self-deception, but does it also work in other primate species? And what about deception in general?
Well, this has a long tradition in this theory of mind research with chimpanzees, to what extent they would use deception, and maybe the evidence is stronger that they would try to hide information from others, like not being seen by others. So they're able to do that. Like Brian Hare has some beautiful experiments on this, so where they try to sneakily go towards a piece of food and they choose the path where the competitor cannot see them over the path where the other one can see them. That also works when it comes to being quiet, taking the quiet approach versus the noisy approach and so forth. So there seems to be some perspective taking. But then the question is, to what extent would they basically plant false evidence to engage in this deliberate deception, and that would be a really good test of inducing false belief in others. And so there is, to my knowledge, no good evidence that is a robust behavior. So really trying to actively deceive someone rather than concealing information from others, that seems to be a major step they're not taking.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to self-deception specifically, is it even possible to really test if other primates, other species that are not really able to communicate like ourselves, if they are really able to perhaps self-deceive, to have some information in their heads that are not really available to them consciously, or something like that.
God, how would we know? This seems something that's so hard, especially hard to assess with a nonverbal species, right? So, they would have to report something in one context and report something else in another context. I wouldn't know how we would even be able to test that. What would you say is like the strongest test of it in humans? Kahneman studies on like fidgeting, the results of something that's supposed to tell something about your true self, and then you finagle it in a way that creates a good impression of yourself on yourself, or what would you say is a good way of testing that?
Well, I don't even know. I was just asking. It just came to my mind that perhaps there would be some way of doing that. I mean, even in humans, I guess that I mean we communicate with one another, but even most of the time, the things that we come up with to explain our own behavior, they are post hoc rationalizations, and to really know what's behind our own behavior and the motivations behind it and things like that, we really have to do elaborate experiments to get at the bottom of our psychology, right?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, right. I mean, I would think that it's more plausible to assume that deception evolves in these kinds of social contexts, right? Before it becomes even useful for you to deceive yourself, right? These concrete contexts of say visual perspective taking or trying to lay a false trail to win some food or something like that, or not be beaten up by someone while sneakily trying to mate with someone else. So that would be more the origin of it, these social contexts. And then once this ability somehow evolves, then it can be used for self-deception, where one has to maybe think about, say, reputation, right? Where you care about your own identity and how other people perceive you, or you want to be proud of yourself. I think all of this must have an origin in some social interaction first, for it to evolve. I mean, maybe in humans it could be that you have to first, then it could be reversed once you have this sophisticated apparatus that is our brain. Then maybe it could be the other way around. But it feels like the evolutionary pressure should be first on trying to outcompete others before you outcompete yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. What would you say are perhaps the aspects of human cognition, or particularly human social cognition and human morality, that you would say really distinguish us from even other great apes, that perhaps they don't have?
Well, I think that one major difference is social norms and fairness norms and moral norms. So that there is just like that a sense of feeling an obligation towards each other to do something, because that is how we are supposed to do it, or how we agreed to perform a certain task. That is something where I don't see good evidence for that in non-human animals. And that is something that's so important for us. And we see that also in kids, that they respond to something breaking the rules, breaking the rules, even though it has no negative consequences for anyone. It's just like, this is how you play the game, and someone is not playing the game by the rules. No, this is a victimless crime, as it were, and still they get upset about it and want to correct it. So norms are a really important thing, and there's, to bring it back to the original question about about cooperation and this issue of the free rider problem. I think what's really striking about human cooperation is that we have these norms to solve the free rider problem, to know how to distribute benefit. So those are fairness norms, right? That we are not just distributing benefit in a way to just reciprocate with each other over time, but because this is just how we somehow think it's supposed to be. Like, if we both worked on this task the same amount, then we are entitled both to have the same amount of profit from it. Or if someone worked harder than the other, then maybe we can skew it in the direction of the one who has provided more input and is more deserving of that based on merit. So I think this is something where we really differ from other animals, and that we have these norms about how to regulate cooperation and how to solve the free rider problem.
Mm-hmm. And that's really important, the social norms, because that also allows for us to really expand our societies and to have these huge societies as we have nowadays,
right,
of hundreds of thousands and millions of people, that most of them are anonymous. I mean, we don't interact with most of them,
right,
and still, because we have these cultural processes where people are able to communicate the set of norms that we have placed in this specific society, then people are able to really predict how they should behave and address other people that they haven't really even met before, right?
That's right, exactly. So we can be more certain that other people will behave in this way, and if they don't, we also assume that we are entitled to kind of do something about it, or that other people will just be displeased with it. So that if there are norm violations, then there could be punishment or ostracism or some form of changing the behavior. So that more on the group, there's more happening on the group level on that end as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Warneken, just before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Oh, I see. Well, our website, I guess. So on my website at University of Michigan, the Social Minds Lab, we place all our articles so people can download it there. And we also, on YouTube, actually, there are several videos of our experiments with children that people can watch there to get a sense of the way we investigate this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Are there any keywords that people can use to find those videos on YouTube? Or
well, my name, I guess, and then I mean, helping in children and chimpanzees. So these and cooperation, I guess that should lead you to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving all of that in the description box of the interview. Okay. And Dr. Warneken, thank you a lot again for taking the time to be here with us today, and it was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. Yeah, all of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Isar Weber. Thank you for all.